Welcome back. It's the Fabulous Four podcast, Duan and myself, with the penultimate episode of our series. I think it's episode 8, maybe. Was that where we're at?
9.
9. Okay, episode 9. So this is the last fight in the tournament of all of these four men fighting each other. And, we're at a place in boxing in the time frame where these guys are a little long in the tooth. And for Marvin Hagler, like we had talked about, like he's retired, though his name pops up often around this time frame. Leonard and Hearns had just had a fight in the summer, and Leonard is right back at it in December against Roberto Duran in their third fight. I guess the first question for me is, when we look at the whole scope of this era, Leonard fighting, 6 months later was a little bit of a surprise, and I kind of wonder, what was the main reason, and also if you think like he was just so frustrated with how he fought against Hearns and wanted to see if he still had what he thought he had.
Yeah, well, last time where we left it, we were in 1989, and at the start of that year, Roberto turned back the clock with that win over Iran Barkley, and he put himself back in the position for money fights. Then it was thrown over to Ray, as you said, for the rematch with Hearns, and he didn't get his end of the bargain quite done. As we said, I think both of us scored that fight for Tommy, but it ended up a draw. Ray didn't want that to be the last memory of his fighting career, so he decided to fight on, and he wasn't particularly interested in that at that point in time in fighting Hagler again, because Marvin was still hanging around, or he wasn't interested in a third fight with Hearns. Roberto was obviously had been chasing the Leonard fight for a long time, but for a long time it also just hadn't been that much of a viable option after No Mas. People didn't really want to see it. After he got that big win over Barkley, it was on the table again. And from Roberto's point of view, he was also not massively chasing another fight with Tommy Hearns. We said it was arguable if Tommy won the fight. So the obvious match to make seemed to be the rubber match between him and Leonard.
So we are in December 1989. The fight is December 7th. Obviously, this podcast is driven a lot by our love of The Four Kings by George Kimball. For folks who are kind of tuning in here late on the show, because we've been doing this for a little bit. But so Leonard, if in Leonard's book, he flat out says that he lost the Hearns fight. Now, he wouldn't say that publicly at the time. I think, and Tommy too. Tommy was just basically like, the judges thought it was a draw, so it was a draw. And Leonard was like, just two soldiers, going whatever. Like, he didn't really say that Tommy had won, but in his book he did say, I probably lost that fight. So he is coming off of a fight in which he thinks that he's lost, and now we've been talking about this relationship that he has with Dave Jacobs, and it's sort of on and off and on and off, and it's off again. Pepe Correa is his trainer. He's really the only guy in the corner too. He's the main guy, and just a couple of like kind of tidbits surrounding them doing this fight. So Bob Arum and Mike Trainer are working together on this. It is promoted by Top Rank, but Budweiser also gets a name in the promotion. So Budweiser's the sponsor of the fight. And so when they're doing like the commercials and like the hype to the fight, Arum basically set up a deal that was like, it's basically going to be a Budweiser commercial. So Budweiser's going to pay for it, but it'll be about Leonard and Duran. So we get the hype out of it with Budweiser basically paying for the commercial. I thought that was kind of brilliant. And so for the purse of the fight, you have Sugar Ray, who's probably making at least a minimum or guaranteed of about 12.5 to 13. I've seen both numbers. And Duran, almost 8. But the problem with Duran's purse is that he's like got so many issues with taxes and with his management that he probably only pockets like, I don't know, like $1 million or $2 million out of it. So kind of sucked for him, being that, you know, this was really the last real money fight of his career. And
well, I think that the story with Roberto at this point was he had got a big tax rebate of like, you know, I think 1.6 or 1.8 million dollars.
It was like a mistake, right?
Yeah, it was a mistake, and he just went out and spent it all immediately, as Roberto's known to do. So then, you know, they came looking for the money, and, you know, they took it out of his purse for this one. And as you said, he had, you know, a lot going on in between, like, you know, his tax, that issue, the amount of tax he was being charged on his purse itself, and then kind of, you know, his legal wranglings that he had going on in the background with past promoters and things like that. So he didn't really pocket that much out of this fight. But what you were just saying about the promotion with, you know, them partnering with Budweiser, you know, it is interesting. They did get Budweiser to foot the bill for it, and just for most of the advertising. And, you know, any of the advertising that was done kind of late. With hindsight being 2020, I kind of look back at this and think that maybe from a promotional point of view, everybody knew this was the end of the era, and you know, it was one last chance to make a big drawing card, because, you know, you talked about it in the intro. There was a very quick turnaround after the draw between Leonard and Hearns. They didn't do the long press tours that they'd done on all the other fights telling the story. They didn't do the big advertising campaign other than, you know, the Budweiser sponsorship. Like, you know, Aram's explanation was that it's, you know, people know these guys at this point. We don't really need to do it. Any of the boys are going to come in late, so we just, you know, we'll just, you know, pull all our interest into those last couple of weeks before the fight. And, you know, the strategy may have worked. You know, they also played big time on nostalgia on this one with the, you know, by naming it Uno Mas and, you know, playing so much into, you know, what had happened previously. I think, you know, the writing is kind of on the wall that, you know, maybe from the promoter's perspective, you know, they knew this was kind of the last throw of the dice for this era.
So another interesting wrinkle to the promotion, or just into the fight in of itself, is that it opens the Mirage, which is a brand new hotel casino on the Strip. And it's the first one that they had built in about 15 years. Aram had done so much business at Caesars, and he knew how to do that, and that's where he wanted the fight. But I think some of the I would say that the buzz for Leonard to do this was to kind of open up this venue and to try and make that a big deal.
The Mirage at that point was, you know, it was opening up as, you know, the biggest hotel in the world and the most expensive one in the world. And, you know, they were making a big time play for the boxing market. They wanted to take that crown away from Caesars because, like, you know, Caesars had been kind of the spiritual home of the Fabulous Four, with the exception of the first two Leonard Duran fights. All the other fights were in Caesars. So, you know, that's what one thing unique to this trilogy is, that, you know, they were the only fights outside of Caesars. But in terms of the Mirage, like, you know, they had other ideas on their mind for where they were going to take their boxing coverage. You know, they wanted to take over this from Caesars, and, you know, part of that was, you know, they wanted to start promoting their own fights. And I think Bob got very frustrated during the course of this promotion, in that, you know, they were taking too much of a heavy-handed approach with it and getting too involved and just not letting the promoter promote. And I think also then, you know, he found out that they were going behind his back trying to coax Duran into signing an exclusive deal with them and cutting him out as the middleman. Right. And obviously Bob flipped his lid over that, and I think he kind of always regretted afterwards that he had taken this fight out of Caesars.
Yeah, and actually Duran's next fight, and we'll talk about, we do have one more episode after this, and we'll call it the epilogue, but it'll be sort of like what happened to everybody after this fight. Because Duran does fight, his next fight is at the Mirage. So I think he loses to Tom Lawler. Is that the guy's name? Pat Lawler. Pat
Lawler, yeah.
Yeah, not filthy Tom Lawler. I got them mixed up. So going into, we sort of know where Ray is. This is his next fight right after the Hearns fight, but we haven't heard from Duran in a little while. So what was Duran doing in the meantime? While at least Leonard and Hearns were active. Hagler obviously retires after the Leonard fight, but where was Duran at, and what was he doing previous to this fight?
Well, for Roberto, it was just about going back to the drawing board. After the Robbie Sims loss, I think most of the people around him kind of washed their hands of him, and kind of looked at it as that, like his story had been told. It was time for him to move on. He set up with a new coach at that time, Hibbard, and basically he was a guy from Panama who had been driving taxis in America. He picked up the pieces with Roberto after when he was kind of at his lowest point, and started training him. And he had these ideas basically that Roberto's problems was all due to how much was letting his weight get out of control, and that's kind of the approach he took. He kind of introduced a lot of new aspects to his training that was outside of boxing work, more exercises and fitness, and getting Roberto's weight down before he went into camp. So he didn't have that uphill battle every time, and it seemed to pay dividends in Roberto's career resurgence. He had 4 or 5 more comfortable comfortable wins to kind of get his wheels back under him, and then he had what was at the time a really big win for Roberto against Iran Barkley, because Barkley at that point was just coming off knocking out Tommy Hearns in his very previous fight, and we all know how Hearns had taken Duran apart. So most people were expecting Barkley to deal with Duran at that point, but it was a very good, close, competitive fight. But Duran, I think if you watch it back, clearly did edge it. He knocked him down in the 11th round. He took over the fight, and he made it his sort of fight. I think he was well deserving his win, and I think it was probably that was Duran's for weight class. He'd won a world title up at the middleweight title up for the WBC, and it was also his last world title. But I think it was probably also his last truly great Roberto Duran performance we'd see. And
if you do want to watch that fight, Duan has a little write up on the website to talk a little bit about it. So. It's funny because in the book, Kimball has this quote in the Four Kings book. Duran is explaining like sort of his bad habits, and then Hibbard changing him a little bit. The quote is the quote is a little rough here, but I'll read it in full. He says, "I love whores. The hookers told me you need to screw with us and then go out and beat the living shit out of that black man. They start kissing me, and I told them, you're right. I come home and tell my woman that it's the last time I drink. Then I start to sharpen myself, and by now, I'm praying for the rematch." Like, what a way to explain the idea that you've let yourself go, you're kind of fat and happy, and now you're dedicated again. Like, I've never heard anyone use whores as like an inspiration.
No, I've got nothing on that
What an oh gosh! Can you? I mean, and then he goes public with that quote as if, oh yeah, this is like normal. This is this is how everyone lives. Like my wife is like right there. Oh my god. Okay, so pre-fight, I had mentioned that Leonard was doing a lot of his stuff in the private. He was not sparring and working out in public. Like he's very secretive, and I do wonder. Because you could look at it in two different ways. You could look at it in that, and this was kind of what happened with the Hagler thing, right? Which was he didn't want to show people if he wasn't feeling like himself. He didn't want to show the public that, because then it would hurt his confidence, and the public would or the reporters would just be like, okay, like this guy doesn't have it anymore, and it was almost a way to sort of prove to himself that he could still do this. But the flip side is that maybe he did feel good, and he was like, okay, like I don't want to show Duran's people like how good I'm feeling, because I've sort of figured it all out, like how to fight with my athletic tools, like not 100%. Like what would you gauge as more of the reason why he wanted to do things so much in private?
That's interesting you say that, because in the build up to this, he was fairly down on, or playing down his own abilities a lot. He was saying, I am getting older, I have slipped some, I don't know whether I've got anything left or not, and I'm not going to know till I get in the ring. And I don't know whether that was gamesmanship, as you said, and maybe he actually did feel really good, and he was trying to lull Duran's people into believing that he was over the hill. And like on the flip side, because I think people will look back at this fight and say, oh, well, of course, Ray won. He is the younger guy. Duran was, 38 at the time. He'd had a couple of resurgent wins, but he'd also had a lot of setbacks in the time since they'd last met. And, I think that the important thing to remember is that, the way a lot of people viewed this was Roberto had been used to fighting as an old man for a really long time and being successful at it, and Ray had not. Ray had been a guy who'd relied on his reflexes and his speed and all those youthful attributes, and so I think a lot of people thought he's the guy who age will catch up with first. If these guys don't have their athleticism, if it sways in Roberto's favor.
So I was like sort of thinking about this, what I wondered is, now Duran he had been fighting for a much longer time without his athleticism. He had to fight at a higher weight because he couldn't keep his weight down. And so I almost feel like he was fighting without his original tools and what made him great for much longer than Leonard was. And in thinking that way, it was almost to me like Duran knows his sort of old self better than Leonard knows his old self. And if you're looking at this, unless if you're a Leonard fan, you're probably not thinking in this way. But as an unbiased, person looking at both of these guys, I was thinking I wonder if Duran is more comfortable with his new style than Leonard is with his new style. And obviously, when we watch the fight, it's absolutely false. But I do wonder if that was sort of the idea behind why this fight was so close with the bettors. It was at 3-1, then it got down to 2-1. I think it ended up 9-5, and so that's a really close fight when it comes to Vegas, and then obviously how wide it is. But I wonder if that was part of the reason why people thought, Duran's got a great chance to win here.
Another thing that I just wanted to remark on, which it came up in Duran's book, and I just thought it was interesting, was that he wanted this fight at 168 pounds, which it ended up being at 162 pound catch weight. And
he weighed in at 158 or something like that.
Yeah, so that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because if you look at Roberto before prior to this fight, he never really had fought much higher than around what that catch weight was, 162, 163. It'd been kind of like certainly after this fight he fought up at super middleweight and even above, but up until this point he hadn't fought at 168 pounds. But he always said like that was kind of Leonard's doing, that the fight was the catch weight. And I think the other thing just that to note on that is, because Ray also weighed inside for the catchweight fight at 160 pound, it was actually a middleweight fight, and Roberto was the champion at middleweight, and by kind of the time-honored tradition, that meant that it actually should have been Roberto's belt on the line as well. That's kind of the question the journalists were asking in the days leading up to the fight: is Roberto's WBC title on the line? And it was kind of, the situation was left very ambiguous with it. Like, Aram said, look, if he had known how much hassle this would have caused, he would have just got one of them to weigh in with a weight in their pocket or something. So they were over the middleweight limit, and they would take that out of the equation because they'd done all their negotiations based on it just being for Ray's title and not for Roberto's. But ultimately, I think like Jose Suleiman came out on the day of the fight, or in the lead up to the fight anyway, and just said, okay, the belt is only, Roberto's belt is only really on the line for him to lose. Ray can't win it, or something to that extent.
Yeah, totally. So, okay, so what is the Frank Warren story here?
What Frank Warren story? So
there's a story in the book in which Kimball says that Frank Warren is shot by a random bullet or something. I
do know that did happen. I don't know the details of it.
Yeah, it's just one of the random, nuggets that Kimball had in here that I didn't really completely understand the story of, but I thought that was kind of weird. I didn't know if this was a legendary story or something that I didn't know about, but yeah. Okay, so I have a question, and so we kind of mentioned, Caesars was in play. There was another venue that was in play. I think it came down to the 3, and they went with the Mirage. But one of the, I think if the fight was held in Caesars, I think it was going to be held in late November. And so when you watch this fight, I think the first thing you think is why in the hell are they fighting outside in December? Just from a weather perspective, right? Why is this the time for them to do this fight outdoors? Because it looks absolutely, it does not look like it's fun for these guys to be out in the cold.
No, it's in December evening, you can see the TV panelists have scarves on and things like that. When Ray comes out to the ring, he's got a woolen hat and clothing on under his boxing robe to keep him warm. And between rounds, they which is something I've never seen at any fight ever before, is they put a blanket over him just so he doesn't cool off in that 1 minute rest period. So the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and Lampley and Larry Merchant kind of joke about this. So in between the fight before the main event and the guys walking to the ring, they just light fireworks for 7 minutes. And as Lampley and Merchant are doing their open, you just see the fireworks in the back, and you can hear them in the back as they're trying to open the pay-per-view. It's ridiculous. I mean, I understand why you would do fireworks, but for, I don't know, maybe, for an event like that, they're trying something different. I don't remember hearing that they lit fireworks for other big fights before the main event, but I thought that was kind of funny. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is part of the reason why the Mirage didn't have a great long innings in boxing.
Yeah. Okay, so the last thing that I thought was pretty interesting is that, talked about Leonard and sort of his attitude for this fight. So he comes out, this is 1989. Michael Jackson is Michael Jackson may have been in the crowd at this fight. I've seen some thing that said that he was there, but Sugar Ray Leonard comes out to a Michael Jackson song as his entrance music. The song is called "Leave Me Alone," and the song is about Michael Jackson's basically the tabloids just writing about him and investigating about him and calling him weird and calling him a freak. And so Sugar Ray Leonard uses that, and I wonder if his mindset is like, I created this thing, and he becomes we've been talking about this through the whole series. He's the first fighter to take that mantle as being a non-heavyweight to be the biggest draw in boxing. And now, we're talking, 10 years later, he is still very popular, still a big draw, but the negative, there's lots of negativity about him now, whether he should hang it up, he's selling, what does Nick Diaz call it? Wolf tickets, like Sugar Ray selling wolf tickets, he doesn't have it, he's propping up these guys because of his name, and we're not getting these good fights. So Sugar Ray comes out to a song, it's basically like an FU to like everybody, and I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and just in the whole lead up to this fight, he did kind of have a bit of a chip on his shoulder about that. people were asking him, like, I think the two things people were asking him about were like, why did Duran quit in the first fight, and why was he fighting at all now? And I think that just kind of stuck in his craw a little bit. He's just like, look, I want to have this fight. I've still got something to offer, and I beat him first time around. So we did see a little bit of a different attitude to Ray, and I think that carried over into this fight. He came out extremely determined. Like, it came out with a fire that I hadn't really seen in Ray in a little while. Like, he was there to get, like, this wasn't an older guy coming to pick up one last paycheck. He was there to go on this night. Yeah,
absolutely. So the fight starts, and one thing that you notice is when Ray goes back to his corner, he's got a blanket, and Roberto doesn't. And what it kind of reminded me of? And this is not like a great analogy, but it reminded me of that one fight where Mike Tyson's corner forgets the inswell. And it's just like, Ray's just a step ahead, right? Like, all the things that make him comfortable and confident. You mentioned him coming to the ring, like, dressed really warmly. And in our write up, our play-by-play and scoring of the fight, you even wrote that, he keeps that on until the last minute possible, that he to stay warm, to sort of like almost be like, look, like, I'm outsmarting these guys. Like, I thought that was super interesting. Just the blanket could almost have been like this, like, strategically, emotionally tactical thing where Duran's like, what the hell, like, how come he's got a blanket and I don't have a blanket?
Yeah, like, Roberto, you look at the other side of the ring, and Roberto just has nothing. Like, he comes out in this tin satin robe, and he's clearly, he's not, like, when you look at Ray, he's warmed up and he's ready to go. Duran is clearly still freezing when he gets in the ring, and like, then between rounds, you see his corner throwing cold water on him and putting ice to the back of his head and face and things like that as well. Like, they're going through the motions of what they would normally be good practice in a fight, but it just kind of goes to show that there was the experience difference, and I guess the preparedness difference from the two corners.
So the fight starts, and it is pretty clear what Sugar Ray's strategy is. He's going to box, and he's going to move, and he's going to make Duran chase him if he wants to engage. And there's a clear advantage in the quickness department and the reflexes department. You can see that, pretty much from round one. Now, Leonard says he did an interview, I think it was a week later, with Larry Merchant. And he said that basically by round 3, he had it all figured out. And he knew that this wasn't going to be that hard of a fight. Even though I've seen this fight before, obviously, when I was a kid, I'm still sort of waiting for Duran to take a shot and really try to put some pressure on him, and it just never really happens. He's game, right? He's staying in there and he's taking shots, and Sugar Ray's landing like 50% of his punches. But I was waiting for Duran to do something, whether it was to maybe hold or rough him up a little bit, or low blow or something, just to show that to show Leonard, like, look, like, you're definitely you definitely still have something, but I'm still who I am too. And it just never happened. And it just was like, as Leonard's piling on the rounds, especially in the beginning, it's almost like Duran just gets kind of frustrated and goes, okay, well, if this is going to be the fight, then I have no chance.
Yeah, it's one of those ones that I think, like, you look at from even the first round and you have the script in front of you of how that fight's going to go. It's quite evident really early on that Ray is going to fight on the outside, and Roberto just doesn't have it in him to shut down the ring, so he's going to be target practice for most of the night. And for those first 3 or 4 rounds, I think Ray fights on the outside. Anytime Roberto takes a step in, he'll just take a step back and tee off on him. And I think the only success Roberto really had in those the first few rounds was he landed a headbutt that busted up Ray's mouth. And then, when you get to the middle rounds, Ray kind of starts to step it up a little bit.
Yeah.
And he does start to fight it, but he starts winning in that aspect too. And I wonder if that was because there was kind of a couple of small segments around the 5th and 6th round where Roberto showed some signs of life, and then Ray got a lot rougher. He hit him low blows. He started hitting him on the break. It's stuff that you didn't usually see from Ray, and I wonder if it's kind of like him sending out a little bit of a message that he was the bully this time around.
Right.
And you did start to see him also bring in the tactics he used in New Orleans a little bit, with the bolo punches and some of the clowning.
And and especially holding on the back of the head and throwing the bolo uppercut.
Yeah, but that also, stopped later on in the fight. And, I think Merchant said on commentary, is it just out of respect for Roberto? Because Roberto took, he just stayed in there. And as he said, he was game as anything. He had nothing to grasp on in this fight. And he just kept taking the shots. And there was shots there that would have put a lot of guys out. And he just, round after round, he just kept coming forward with nothing really to sink his teeth into. And, I think maybe over the course of that time, Ray kind of went, okay, I'm winning this fight, but this guy's earned my respect at the same time. I'm not going to try and make him look like a fool or anything like that. I'm just gonna box my game plan and see out this decision.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point in that not only is Leonard beating him at his game, he's also beating Duran at his own game, and that has to be super frustrating for Duran. But there is a moment, I think it's in the 7th or the 8th round, where I thought he was going to fall, and he doesn't. He doesn't go down. I think if Leonard was a little bit more aggressive, he could have gone for it a little bit more, but he decided, to stay on the game plan. But there was a moment in that fight where it's I don't remember Duran going down. Is he going to go down? It's no, he doesn't go down. But imagine, I almost feel like his pride is what sort of kept him upright and kept him finishing, through the 12th, because, he couldn't live down the no mas thing for a long time. And imagine if he gets stopped by Leonard, or if he gets put down by Leonard, with the pride that he has, that he probably would not have taken that well at all.
No, and I remember the moment you were talking about, Ray kind of catches him with a hook, and he staggers like he's going to fall. He kind of takes a couple of stagger steps across the ring, but he somehow just regains his balance and is back at it. There is one hope spot, I suppose, for Duran, which is in the 11th round, where he catches Ray. Like, I think Ray gets overconfident, and he just wings this big looping right hook at him and busts his eye open terribly. And it's the type of cut that, if this had been a 15-rounder, it might have been a problem. I'm sure, almost certain the doctor would have came over to have a look. You know, with 1 round to go, I think they're not going to stop Ray. But it caused a lot of damage. And you know, then when we go into the 12th round, Ray does pretty much nothing. He is just getting out of there for that 12th round. It's the only round of the fight I gave Duran is the 12th. I'm not sure how you scored. I scored a shutout 1-11, and then I gave Duran the 12th.
Yeah, I mean, I gave Leonard the 12th as well, just because neither guy really did anything. But like that cut, legitimately, in the corner, they're trying to they can't, like, it's still bleeding coming out for the 12th. Like, they can't get the bleeding to stop. And so this is kind of what I meant, and I'm glad you mentioned it, which is, why didn't Duran just, like, start going for broke? Like, I mean, obviously, again, frustrated, tired, probably, you know, I mean, you know, he wasn't doing well. But man, this is like the moment where if you're a Roberto Duran fan, you're like, here's hope. I got this. He's got it. We're gonna like, you know, we're gonna stop Leonard. And then in the 12th round, he just no big deal. I'm not gonna do anything different.
Just one other thing to note is, like, there was a moment also that I thought was quite telling about like Ray's approach to this fight. I think it was at the end of the 9th round. He goes back to his corner and he says, "To hell with the crowd," because they're booing him.
Yep.
Like, he does not care one bit that people are not enjoying this fight. He's here to, you know, he's all business here tonight. He wants to get that win. And, you know, I think that's what you see in the 12 as well, when, you know, maybe at a different point of his career, Ray would have got suckered into fighting it out in that 12th round with the cut. And this one, he just went, okay, look, the work's done. Let's just see this out.
So, end of the fight, and it's a clear decision victory for Leonard. Duran does not take this loss well. Obviously, he's not one to take losses well, especially to Leonard. And the post fight kind of chatter by Duran is that, you know, look, he's a clown. Like, he ran the whole fight. He's got the referee in his pocket. He's got the judges in his pocket. That's why he won. That one is a little hard to take because of how wide the score was. I feel like this was more personal than anything else of his reaction to losing.
Yeah, I think, you know, yeah, as he said, it was kind of very Roberto what you got in the end of. At the end, in the immediate aftermath of this fight, he's like, "Oh, Leonard's a clown." Like, he did, like, cause he'd been saying that, you know, in the build-up that Leonard wouldn't fight with him, and, you know, then this is kind of like his vindication of, like, "Oh, I knew he wouldn't fight with me. He's just a clown." And, you know, he also kind of made the point that how badly Leonard was busted up. Like, Duran looked pretty much fine coming into the fight. We talked about the headbutt. We talked about the cut opening over his eye. Like, I think Ray had got 60 stitches after this fight or something like this.
Yeah, there was the cut from the 11th, and then he got hit again in the 12th, and he got another cut.
Yeah, and I think on the same eye, wasn't it? And yeah, so, you know, he looked like Ray looked really beaten up after this. I think, you know, Duran went with the kind of the Tank Abbott logic of, you know, well, look, you know, I look fine and so I kind of won the fight. But, you know, he's a lot more measured in how he discussed this fight years later in his book. You know, he talks about this as like, this being the fight that he knew it had gone, like that he knew that he wasn't the same fighter he used to be. It's the first time he'd really kind of felt like he was old, and he knew that, like, he knew what he wanted to do and he couldn't do it. His legs weren't there. Mm-hmm. You know, he said his eyesight wasn't as good as it had been in the past. He couldn't see the punches coming. And, you know, those were kind of, you know, it was just, you know, Leonard was kind of the better man in that respect. So, you know, I think that's something he softened on a bit. And, you know, post-fight, I think Ray kind of gave Roberto a lot of credit. He think, you know, he kind of knew what it was as well. And, he, you know, he knew, I think, probably Roberto would have taken it quite hard. You know, he was kind of putting it across as like, okay, look, this is a 38-year-old guy. We're two veterans in there. You know, he never quit the whole time, and that type of thing. So, you know, but I think, like, you know, then the thing for Ray is, like, for with Ray is, you know, I think now that he'd gotten that last win and, you know, made a bunch more money, and he had got beaten up, I think most people thought, like, there's nothing for him to come back. Like, this is the way for Ray Leonard to end his career. Because it was, in a lot of ways, a great performance from Ray. I think it's the last real, whatever greatness was left in Ray Leonard, I think we saw it in this fight. And you kind of ask the question of why for any reason would he come back? And, you know, he did end up coming back in the end. But, you know, maybe this should have been a swan song.
So I think if you watch this fight and you look at sort of a recharged Leonard, I think the first question is as well, okay, could he do this against, because, you know, the question was, you know, is he going to put over Michael Nunn? Like, that was a lot of the question when this fight was over. But the other questions were, okay, is he going to dance with Hagler again? Is he going to dance with Hearns again? And so he actually does neither of the three, and we'll talk about the two fights that sort of ends his career. You know, he takes on someone who's probably more dangerous than Michael Nunn in the next fight. But he came out of this fight in the 12th round, I think, telling Pepe, like, I could have gone 5 more. Like, think about that, right? Like, it was almost like he found a little bit of the fountain of youth, because you know, after this fight's over, he thinks that he could continue to go, and he was sort of talking about his legs, like, I had 5 or 6 more in these. So if you're wondering why he just didn't decide to quit, that was probably a big reason, was how well he did in this fight. And that's how it always is, right? With fighters, is like, man, I feel really good, I could do it again. And then, you know, what you don't think about is the time in between, and how long it takes you to stop being sore, and how training all of a sudden, you know, again, sucks. And so that had to have been part of the reason. I think, like, you know, I think in the fight game, things very rarely end at a peak. You know, people will always take that one fight more, you know, until they don't have it anymore. And I think, you know, we saw that with 3 out of the 4 guys in the four Kings. They fought on a lot longer than they should have. And I think, you know, and, you know, in terms of the series, this fight was probably, you know, in terms of the Fabulous 4 series, this was the fight that was that for a lot of people, the fight that was the one too many. And, you know, as I mentioned, you know, the one guy who out of the series who probably ended at the right time was Marvin Hagler. And I think, you know, in a roundabout way, this fight was probably part of why Marvin didn't come back, because it was so poorly received. I'm not sure, like, you know, Marvin had always said he would come back for one last lucrative, huge, big money fight. And, you know, because this fight went down the way it was, I think, you know, the jig was up in a lot of ways. I think, you know, people just thought, okay, look, you know, this era is over, and the money wasn't going to be on the table for, you know, another Leonard Hagler or a third Leonard Hearns. So I think, you know, that's in a lot of ways will be the legacy of this fight. It is kind of the closer of this era, because maybe you just wouldn't have known if it hadn't happened. Maybe you just wouldn't have known. Right. So you mentioned about, you know, the fight not being well received. I think a lot of the writers and you know, some of the casual fans who had heard about, you know, this great war between these two guys. It's a great rivalry. They hate each other, and then it ends the way that it ends. I found some quotes from a writer named Lee Benson from the Deseret News, which was a paper in Salt Lake, Utah, the great fighting city of Salt Lake. And I have no idea why he was just covering the fight, but he had some interesting sort of like, just by being there, he had some information that I didn't see anywhere else. So he says one of the like. It's like one of, I don't think it's the lead, but it's like the second quote of his article. He goes, "You want strange? This was strange. First, 16,000 people sitting on metal bleachers in a Las Vegas hotel parking lot cheer when the announcer tells them they spent a collective $9 million to watch a fight." That was funny. And then he says,
just on that, this was at the time that 9 million was a record gate at the time, and Demirage still lost a ton of money on it.
Yep.
And any of the subsequent promotions that they ran themselves, they lost a ton of money on it. And then they decided to leave the boxing to boxing promoters after that.
And just to show you how big money this was, so Sugar Ray Leonard, Duran in 1989, sort of over the hill guys who still have names. WWF comes to Caesars, so about 3.5 years later, and the gate is 1.2 million. So just, sort of a big boxing event versus a big wrestling event, like that's the difference, right? The difference is like $8 million in gate, which is pretty amazing to me, because the WrestleMania 9 is 3.5 years later. You would think that the prices, would be a little bit higher, but this is, big time boxing in Vegas. Like, this is how you were able to make so much money with these guys. So he also wrote, by the time the fight was over, only about 2/3 of the crowd remained. So people walking out in the main event. Now, this is just his judgment, his guess. He's not, I'm sure he wasn't counting necessarily. But so he also said, his last quote was, or the last quote that I pulled, as Bob Arum, the fight's promoter, said after the smoke, such as it was, had cleared Thursday night, obviously, their styles don't mesh. With true promoter prudence, he saw fit not to say so until after the gate was safely counted. Like, you gotta love it. Like, Bob, responding to the negative press is like, oh yeah, maybe, styles don't mesh. That's why we didn't get a great fight. Forgetting that, years prior, their styles were perfect for like this kind of fight. But anyways, I just, obviously, and maybe that's part of, we mentioned at the top of this, maybe that's part of Bob's strategy, was him knowing that, if we push this fight hard as like a great fight, it's going to, and it's not a great fight, it's going to look bad in the end. And it still looked bad in the end, for them. Okay.
But we talked a little bit about, I suppose, just about like, people thinking Ray should retire. Just when you mentioned Bob there and, talk about styles didn't match. One of the things he said was like, because nobody thought Roberto was going to retire, because we already talked about, the money issue and that he was going to still need more paydays. But I kind of, what Bob said at that point was just, look, Roberto fought well against Barkley because he was there to fight him, and that's what we're gonna do with him from now on. We're just gonna put him in there where he has a fair fight, where guys are gonna stand and trade with him, rather than like somebody like Leonard, where he just doesn't have the legs to chase them down. Which I thought was interesting, to just, firstly, to be that honest, and secondly, that that is kind of the direction Roberto's career went after this point. He was put in, with fighters that would suit him a lot more. But I guess, kind of close this out, there's just a couple of things that, I think are the questions you're left with. And one is like, kind of like, what did the fight mean when it happened this late? And the other one is, what did it mean to each of the fighters? And to answer the first one, I think maybe it meant more than people kind of give it credit for, because we look at Ray as the top fighter of the Fabulous Four era, and maybe this fight plays some role in that he came out at the end of the series as the guy who had one up on everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You take this fight away, right? Ray went 1-1 with Duran, and his win against Duran would have been the one that people looked at as like that was Duran's loss rather than Ray's win. He had the super close fight with Hagler, which could have went either way. He nearly lost to Hearns the first time, but turned it around. The second time he drew. So I think, if you take this fight out of the equation, maybe you kind of look more at the Fabulous Four era as like, these were four great fighters that were all beat each other.
Mm-hmm.
And just because you kind of finish with that gloss with, Ray is the guy who beat all of them and came out with a winning record against all of them. That puts him the one step above everybody else in it.
That's an interesting way to look at it. He put the cap on it, and he did while winning the last fight. Yeah, I think that's a kind of an interesting way to look at it. And Hagler would probably get very mad if by saying that. Like he probably thinks that because of how he beat Tommy. Well, actually, he didn't really beat Duran like people thought he should have. So yeah, that's actually kind of an interesting thought. Okay, so I guess the last thing to do here is kind of talk about. Well, I guess the one other thing to add is I wonder deep down if because we know Ray was a little sensitive to the commentary that Duran quit, and that kind of became the story of that fight rather than that Ray forced Duran to quit. I do wonder if the lack of appreciation for this performance bothered him, because while one way to look at it is that he put on a boxing clinic, the other way to look at it is he was clearly ahead in a fight that he could have probably done a little bit more damage to and was probably still good enough to beat Duran, but he was kind of still respectful of Duran, of the power, and
he did say afterwards that he felt he could win this fight if he had stood there and fought with Duran, but he said it would have been a much tougher and closer fight if he had done it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so but I do wonder if that sort of the narrative afterwards, I wonder if that bothered him. In he doesn't really cover it that much in his book, because he kind of goes in the book it's more about why he continued to fight and why he needed it, and he's still dealing with his issues, with his substance abuse and with moving on from Juanita, and so he doesn't really talk about sort of like the mental aspect of this fight as much, not getting a lot of the credit. But it feels like, because watching that Larry Merchant interview after, it seems like he's still a little bit on edge. Like he's still like a little frustrated with with the narrative that about him at this time.
Maybe, but I do think he feels like he took something back in this fight. I just get the sense that because as we talked about, he did not care one bit that people didn't really enjoy the fight. In terms of the crowd, or the press didn't like it. He didn't really care that much. He felt like he was kind of shrugging his shoulders and go, look, hey, I fought my fight and it was successful. And I think it did give him that extra credibility of he was the guy who beat everybody in his era, and it's and at that point, at that point of his career, he's still undefeated, with the exception of the first Duran loss, which he's twice avenged. So he is, it does stand him out ahead of the rest of the pack from that era because of that. And I think, on Roberto's side, I think maybe he actually needed this fight as well a little bit. I think maybe it went some ways to erase what happened in New Orleans, that he did have this fight that he had so little success in, but he was so brave, and he fought to the end and hung in there, and he didn't quit. Maybe that for Roberto, I don't think cured the Nomad situation entirely, but maybe it went some way to help him cope with it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, so I think we're pretty much done here, unless you had anything else to add that you wanted to add.
No, that's me done for this fight. I guess my last thing on this would be that, history has been very unkind to this fight. And I think we were both talking about this before we started recording today, and it's not the worst fight in the world. It is two guys who are getting up there in years, but you do still see a very, very good Sugar Ray Leonard in this fight, and it's in a lot of ways it is still a joy to watch. Yeah,
absolutely. So the last episode to sort of cap the entire thing is we're going to catch up with all these guys, because two of them, or actually all three out of the four, continue fighting after this moment. Ray only has two more fights, but Hearns and Duran continue to fight. And, I do have questions that I want to ask you, and that I'll sort of answer myself about, just kind of like, which of these fights, what was your favorite, or which event, or, if you could go back in time and be ringside to one of the, which is that one. So I want to have some fun questions like that, and we can kind of get into, a little bit of hypotheticals about each guy, and, who was the definitive guy. We just kind of talked about that with Ray winning to cap the whole thing. But yeah, I think, we'll catch up with our friends here and sort of see where they end up, and thankfully today they're all retired, because it felt like Tommy and Roberto were going to fight forever there for a little while, but yeah, we'll catch up with them and see kind of how everyone ended their careers, and yeah, we'll do that as the last episode. All right, so for Duan, I'm Double G. We will catch you in the next episode to end the whole thing. Thanks for listening.